This is Labor Day weekend, and the schools are already in session, even though I don't think that's a very good idea. I operate according to the old rule that school shouldn't start after Labor Day, but that's life. I'm not so sure that in the sermon we have to say anything about Labor Day. In a sense, it has lost its significance. And we are in the Gospel of Mark sequence. Perhaps you do know who I am, and that is I'm David Scaer, and I teach here at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I have begun my 50th year here, coming to a complete half century. And in some way that ought to be noteworthy, but maybe not. And we are dealing with in this pericope season, we are dealing with the Gospel of Mark. Since I have not, by the time I had a congregation, the Synod has moved over to the 3-year series. So it alternates between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think this is really great. I don't have the opportunity to preach every Sunday, but I certainly favor this approach of going through each of the Gospels. I think one of the great disservices that have been done in gospel studies or understanding the scriptures is creating a gospel harmony. Anyway, I think it's offense against the Holy Ghost, because when you look at the pericopes, in parallel pericopes side by side, you see they're not really the same, and that each evangelist, every writer, had his own particular take on the matter. There's also a great similarity. We're going to, in doing this through today's pericope, which goes from Mark 7:24 to 37, we'll have to see how far we can get through this. I have in front of me the gospel. I have a synopsis, and I use the synopsis, which is no longer in print, and maybe it can be gotten online, and that is the synopsis of the Gospels by Bernard Orchard, who I knew. May his soul rest in peace. And I use this rather than the Aland volume, because it's larger. Now, the purpose of this synopsis is that to the left of the synopsis on the page, you have Matthew's rendition of the account, and to the right, you have Mark's rendition of the account. And as you go along, of course, there's similarities. It's the same account. The Syrophoenician woman. You begin to notice things. And just as a preview of what you're going to expect, is that they say that Luke is the historical narrative. When you say Luke is the historical narrative, I would put the emphasis on narrative. In other words, it's a story. Well, with Mark, all the Gospels are narratives. They certainly are. Well, in Mark, it has to do with actually the details of the situation, which I find fascinating. And Matthew is the theologian. So we'll take a look at the pericope first. It has 2 sections. One, the one of the Syrophoenician woman, and the other, the healing of the deaf mute. From there he got up and he went into the area of Tyre and Sidon, and he came he went into a house, and I got to check the English on this one. Nobody knew him. 7:24, and would not have anybody know it. That he'd not want his identity known, and he was not able to accomplish that. He was not able to sneak away, so to speak. And immediately a woman heard about him, she had a daughter with an unclean spirit. And she fell at his feet, that is the feet of Jesus. Now she was a Greek woman. By ethnicity, she was Syrophoenician, and asked Jesus, that he would throw out the demon from her daughter. And he said, "Is it permissible to feed the children? It is not good to take the bread of the children and to throw it to the puppy dogs. And she answered and says to him, Yea, Lord, but the puppy dogs, they eat the scraps that fall from the table of the children. And he said to her, on account of this, you have the word. On this point, and the demon left from the daughter. And he went out of the house. And when she went out, she went to her own home and found the child lying on a cot, and the demon had left. Now, in looking at this particular pericope, we're dealing with something which is quite different than Matthew. Matthew takes it in a theological way, and Mark does it, provides some of the details which can be fascinating. Now, if you, in many of our Greek Bibles in the back, you will have a map of this particular region, and you might want to take a look at that. This kind of map is found in the back of Bibles. It's not that difficult to find out. That Jesus is in the boundary area of Tyre and Sidon, and at least we were discussing this. Is this the boundary between Tyre and Sidon with Galilee? Or is this the boundary lines between Tyre and Sidon, which lie on the Mediterranean Sea? It seems that the latter one seems to be the case. Now, if that really is so, then Jesus is quite far from home. He is not in the land. He is not in his own land. He's not in a land where the Jews are located. Now, this is a marvelous thing because it kind of does away with the stereotype that Jesus conducted his ministry just among the Jews. We have to say that because first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, but we can take it to the extreme that we actually do not look at the biblical data that says he is with his disciples and he's conducting his ministry in a land which is absolutely foreign. And the mere fact that she's identified as a Greek indicates that Jesus was very competent in the Greek language, as was the disciples, and that he taught in the Greek language. There's nothing to suggest here that she knew Aramaic. Obviously, she did not know Hebrew. And who's ever reporting on this particular account seems to be aware of the day-to-day activities of Jesus. It says here that he went into a house because he didn't want anybody to know that he was in town. And this brings up the Markan secret in the English, and he would not have anybody know it. He entered a house, he would not have anybody. This is a question of the Markan secret. They try to get a theological motive out of that. I think it rather reflects the fact that Jesus did not want, he was not a preacher who was looking for attention. Then we're told that he did not succeed in this because people knew who he was and they followed him very carefully, and they actually found him. And one person who finds him is a woman whose daughter has an unclean spirit. She comes and she falls at his feet. Now, mentioning this account does not appear in Luke. It appears in Matthew. So supposedly, if you're a critical scholar, you would say that Mark is the source for Matthew. Matthew does put a more theological motif on it, in that Matthew uses the term that she cried out, eleison me, Kyrie, Kyrie eleison. It almost sounds like it's liturgical. My daughter is in a bad way because of a demon. And then Matthew includes the account of the data that the disciples weren't too pleased with this activity of this woman and wants Jesus to send her away. And in a very pompous way, says they cry after us. They put themselves in the center. Now, none of that is in Mark at all. Matthew may have put those details in, or that part of the story in order to indicate that the apostles were not of any great faith at all. There seems to be something negative in having included that kind of material. There's no reference. And the other thing that Matthew has in a negative sense, I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the woman is described as worshiping Jesus and then saying the Kyrie again, Kyrie boethai. That's missing. It's really striking that is missing in Mark's account. Could very well be that Matthew, when he told the account, used it for his own theological purposes to show the deity of Jesus, the dependency of the church upon him, and maybe in some way to deprecate the apostolic office, that those who possess the apostolic office generally sometimes don't get things right. I think the best word to describe how Marx proceeds with this particular way is the word graphic. The woman in Matthew is demonized, which is a theological term, and in Mark, it's described as an unclean spirit. Now that opens up the meaning of what does the word akathartan, verse 25, an unclean spirit. Well, was the uncleanliness of the spirit, or did it have to do with with the language of the spirit? That the spirit that possessed her, that possessed the child, spoke blasphemous language, or did the spirit leave this poor child in an unclean situation? Maybe even feces around, completely unwashed. Of course, this brings up the question. Many of our parishioners have to deal with not necessarily people who are demon-possessed, but people who find themselves in unclean situations because that's the way sick people are. This is not a clinical or antiseptic picture of an unclean spirit. Matthew puts it in a theological thing, actually a person who is in league with the devil. And I think a word has to be said about this because from time to time we are dealing with children who are really a handful, and it does cross the mind of the pastor that the child is maybe demon possessed, and we should have a rite of exorcism. That cannot be ruled out, but certainly the question is that certainly the influence of Satan can be seen. That's not indicated here. He doesn't go in, by the way. Mark doesn't go into the data. He also simply says that she comes and falls down at his feet. Now that particular episode is missing in Matthew. And that is, Matthew says she comes and she worships him. Matthew puts it almost he puts it in a liturgical setting, which is always a lot more comfortable for clergy persons to handle. There is a kind of desperateness in Mark's account of the Syrophoenician woman, a sense of desperateness, and that is, she wants to. Have you ever had a child that the child is talking to you, and the child maybe has to be 1, 2 years old, or maybe 3? I don't think that old, and the child wants your attention, so the child grabs your face between your hands, grabs your cheeks, and forces you to look at him. Well, this is what this is. This woman wants all the attention of Jesus. Now, this says something, by the way, of the pastoral ministry, and that is you all, most of you, all of you, already know that the parishioner wants the attention of the pastor. A lot of things stand in the way of the pastor giving the attention to what? One, you do know, by the way, there's so much time is spent on the internet. That's a lot of time. But the people in the congregation have to know that they are the subject of your intention. That is extremely important. And here's a picture of prayer. You just throw yourself at God, and you make it impossible for him to ignore you. Now, she is described as a Greek who was a Syrophoenician. Now, that's kind of a gentle term. Matthew calls her a Canaanite woman. I always like these discrepancies, if that's what you want to call them, because it tells you what's on the mind of the writer. And that is, by Matthew calling her a Canaanite, that is the more pejorative term, because if everything had gone according to plan, she would not have any existence at all, because God gave command to Joshua and to the judges to engage in a little ethnic cleansing and get rid of the Canaanites. And Mark here specifically tells us she was a Greek, a Syrophoenician. Now, does this mean, and I think there's a possibility since it's in Tyre and Sidon, that this was a Greek colony? And the Greeks were there at least from around the 500 to 600 BC. So she may have been exactly that. She was part of the Greek colony, which of course is a Greek city. You know the ancient world. There were Greeks all over the place. These were trading cities. That's the way to keep the business going. You send your own people all over. They have that in the Hanseatic League. Germans were living up in Norway. And she's a Syrophoenician woman by birth, genetically. It seems as if Mark knows the Gospel of Matthew, and to make sure there is no misunderstanding, Canaanite can be pejorative. A Greek, a Syrophoenician woman, it might not be such a negative term. It looks like Mark knows the Gospel of Matthew, and he wants to, I don't want to say clean it up, but he wants to be specific. And here, by the way, the cry of desperation is not so severe. It's simply, she asks him to throw the demon out of her daughter. And the next sentence, which is the next verse, verse 27, doesn't exactly seem to fit into the flow of the argument, because there is no reference, there's no prior reference to taking the food of the children and giving it to the puppies. It says here, let first the children be fed. Let the children be fed. So this is metaphorical language. It reads more like this. It's not that I am going to reject your request. Rather, you're going to have to wait online and wait your turn. It does not fit. Let first the children be fed. And even here, children is used in a metaphorical way. It's a parable. It's parabolical, and it speaks about bread and children and puppies. Well, all the language is symbolical here. Jesus is not speaking of canines and what their role is in the household. That's the superficial meaning. He's speaking about something else. Of course, I always find out that people who don't understand jokes do not think metaphorically. And here, the children are the Jews. She must know that. She must recognize that Jesus is Jewish, and that the Jews have the unique title of being the children of God. Jesus doesn't speak in terms that she doesn't understand. What's amazing is the term bread. And that is in Matthew, it is more obvious that the bread there is the Eucharistic bread, the bread of the Holy Communion. It doesn't seem like that's prime thinking in Mark, which means we should run as far as we can from using the harmony of the Gospels. The harmony of the Gospels come together because people are embarrassed that God can speak in two different ways and that he can use the same words for different purposes. Whoever puts the harmony of the Gospel loses its unique character. And the unique character of Mark, by the way, you start off by Jesus walking slyly through the neighborhood in order to get any possibility that people will recognize him. So he has to be a famous person. They know he's in town. By the way, people today whom we call celebrities because they're famous, we never know why they're famous. They're only famous because they are famous. Try to engage in ordinary activities. They have their own personal lives. Members of the British royal family will sometimes dress up in ordinary clothing without having the Secret Service or their guards, the detectives around them, because they want to. This is the picture of Jesus. It's not a big parade. There's something that has the mark in the gospel, as if the person who was writing this has some kind of knowledge about how Jesus did things, and how the people reacted to him. The story, the account, Matthew gives it a very theological. She worshipped Jesus. Here, she fell down at the feet of Jesus, which I think is absolutely magnificent picture of how the Christian approaches God, and that the Christian does not approach God with all kinds of exquisite theological and liturgical language. It's simply saying help. It's simply saying SOS. And the word please does not fit before the word SOS. It's May Day, things are really a bad way. Pray to God, get to the point, without all the introduction. And then in this question too, it says here it's not to fit to the dogs. Now I've checked out with some of the colleagues and others too about how this is preached upon. That Jesus is calling her a dog. No, Jesus is not calling her a dog. These are the household pets. And some of you might be living in those kind of circumstances. That's fine. Where the animals are a part of family life. I've seen those pet advertisements on the television that the dogs are considered members of the family. Look at your Christmas cards. You have Christmas cards from your nieces, your nephews, and maybe you even sent it out. Your children's with the family dog, as if the dog is a member of the family. That's the way it is. We don't have to go out to the farm, even though I'm in the farm. The dogs are a fixture out there. That's the way they are. I don't know who lets them into the house, but they do have them come into the house. And if you do have I like the comic strip All in the Family, because the dog has the great benefit of a very good diet by being near the kid who is in the high chair. And the food is going. Thank heavens God makes young people the parents of little children, because no matter what you do, the kid's sitting in the high chair and the food is going all over the place. And so Jesus says here, it is not fit to take the bread of the children and to throw it to the canines. And the woman answers, yes, Lord, but the canines, that is the puppy dogs, the household pets, eat from the crumbs of the children under the table. This is an absolutely magnificent picture. Jesus is not calling her a dog. You know what made Jesus a great teacher? He let the people, He let the people come to their own conclusion. It wasn't that he sat down proposition after proposition after proposition. That bores the living daylights out of the people. And they just memorize facts. No, she comes, look, in this particular story, she knows who she is. She recognizes herself not as a dog, but a household pet. She also knows that Jesus is setting her up. That Jesus, by calling her a household pet, is giving her the answer to the question, to the problem that he presents. The problem is, it's not good to take, you don't take a plate of food, set it at the table, bring up a chair or a bench, and ask the dog to sit there and eat. No, that's not the way it goes. It goes the other way around. The dog has to wait for the kids to finish eating. Now, there's something else in here too, and that is, does Jesus suggest that the children who are the Israelites are not really eating their food? Now, in Matthew, the crumbs that fall from the master, that fall from the master's table, is more likely a reference to the Holy Communion. The language there fits the liturgical term, because he says it's not fit to take the bread of the children and give it to the animals. And her answer is, "Yea, Lord, don't the canines eat from the crumbs that fall from the table of their lords?" All of a sudden, it's not the table of the children, but the table of the lords. It has certainly fits 1 Corinthians, where the Holy Communion is called the table of the Lord. But it has to be plural in this context because of the use of the children. You're mixing language. You don't have that firm language here. To hear the crumbs, unless, of course, Mark's readers are aware of Matthew and are reading it in a liturgical context. But it's quite brilliant. We get back to the business that Jesus is really a Socratic teacher, and that is the Germanic teacher. He lectures. For years, it was customary at our seminaries in St. Louis and Fort Wayne or Springfield that the instructor would lecture from the same notes year after year. And there's even a tradition, those of you who are acquainted with this kind of situation, that the students would have copies of the professor's notes, which they had compiled through the passing on. In fact, just like we have various traditions of the Gospels, well, the students would have various traditions of the from a given professor, and they would sit there with the manuscripts in front of them, underlining as he spoke. Now, Jesus was not like this. Jesus actually gave them a problem, to the hearers, a problem which they had to figure out. And you find out that here is a woman who was not brought up in the Hebrew or the Jewish culture. She may undoubtedly have known something about it, but she didn't have the extensive education you would have in a good old synagogue. She knew that Jesus was not talking about table manners. So much for that the scripture has one sense. The topical sense is only a sign of what's under the undersense. And it seems to be less liturgical and more having to do with the substance, that the bread in this particular account happens to be Jesus himself. That she is entitled to Jesus as much as the Jews are. So we get back to the metaphor of the kids at the table. The kids are getting the first course. The puppies are getting the second course. And she doesn't ask to be a child. She's quite content to be on the second level. And there was a time when, for a few years, that I was entitled, because of where I was going, to sit in first class. Now, for the last 10 years or so, I've lost that entitlement. And if I go someplace, I am that's very humiliating, to be in the fourth section of people who get on the airplane. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, you go on last. The only way you can console yourself is by saying you're going to get there at the exact same time as the people who are up in the first class. That's the way she looks at life. She's just content with salvation. She's just content that Jesus will be able to do something for her. She's not asking for the first place. And Jesus is matter of fact here. According to the word, go. And so, Jesus said, you have what you want. I think this is a good reason to have prayers which are a little shorter than usual. You don't have to, it's not a big long story here of an exorcism. And it says here, the demon went out of Jesus says, the demon went out of your daughter. It's an accomplished fact. And it's good, it's done. And then comes verse 30, Kai apoluzai ais tun oikan ores heran tun paidan. She went away into her house, going away into her house, she found the child. I find that's a magnificent statement, because somehow Mark knows about this. Here you have a description that you don't have in Matthew, that this woman is in one house with Jesus. She's in the house, by the way, where he tried to sneak away from anybody. He was in the house where he hoped he would not be found, and he was found. Now we're told that the woman left the house that Jesus went in, went to her own house, and she found the child. I think the best somebody was following this woman, I think just to check and see if what Jesus said would come true, that the daughter would be relieved from the unclean, from the demon. From here, here it's called the demon. Maybe it was Maybe it was a concept of unfaith, of unbelief. Okay, Jesus said the demon had to leave. Now let's see it. Somebody followed her to where she was living, and she went into the house, and sure enough, the line on the cot, a bed, that is not told in Matthew's story. She's lying on the bed, and the demon had gone out. The demon had gone out. I think the best explanation is this, that Peter, who is the inquisitive one, Peter is the one who was lurking around while Jesus is on trial, is the one who saw this. And he is the one who is the source of this information. If you look in the gospel, that's the way he is. I mean, Jesus goes on trial and he's looking around. Peter is the source behind the Gospel of Mark. But in what way is he the source? He's not the source that Peter is referring to a written document. He knows the Gospel of Matthew, and he certainly is the most prominent person in the Gospel of Matthew, so he might have, and maybe the Gospel of Matthew was written as a kind of a tribute to him by the prominent position that he has. But as the Gospel of Matthew is being read, and then he is ascending the pulpit in order to preach, he is giving us these details which are lacking in the original story. Now we come to the second part of the pericope, and that is, again, he comes into the boundaries of Tyre, and he comes through Sidon into the Sea of Galilee in the middle of the boundaries of the Decapolis. So Jesus is now, if you're following the map, apparently Tyre is on the Mediterranean. Jesus goes a little bit north through Sidon, and then through the Sea of Galilee into the middle of the Decapolis. Now that part of the itinerary, well, I belong to another generation. I don't use Google Maps or whatever that is. I take out the old map, and you can look at the map. I wonder why he went up into Sidon, but he's now in the area of the Decapolis, which is on the other sea other side of the Sea of Galilee. Again, this is not a Jewish-speaking area. And they brought to him a person who was deaf and tongue-tied. And I'm going to read this in English, just to keep the story going here. Then he returned from the Tyre of Sidon and went from Tyre, and he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. So he's back near Capernaum, and he went through the region of the Decapolis. That's on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. If you have a chance to go to Palestine, I think it's great. I've been there once. I didn't absorb all of it, and I'd love to go back. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they besought him to lay his hand upon him, and taking him aside from the multitude privately, he put his fingers into his ears, he spat and touched his tongues. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly, and he charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed, and they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. Again, in this particular pericope, the data is more extensive in the Gospel of Mark than in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's not found in the Gospel of Luke. Now they brought to him a man who was deaf. And if you look at the word magala'an in verse 32, of this word right here, magalan, it's almost as if the poor guy had a gag in his mouth. And as pastors, the first item in becoming a preacher or a pastor is you have to speak clearly. In fact, if you don't speak clearly, the people, you might have the best discourse, but no one's going to be able to hear you. And of course, we're all getting older, and you got to speak louder. This is really a kind of a horrible word. He was magala'an. He was more than tongue-tied. He spoke like the words were caught within his cheeks. And they brought him so that he could lay his hand on him. Now, this is sacramental. Something is of value. You might have a difficulty. Well, it's the Word who did it. Sure, it was the Word that did it. But there has to be are you going to go against the Scriptures? There has to be something here that there's a value in the hands of Jesus. He placed his hands on him. Epithea auto te kyaira. And it says Jesus took him aside away from the crowd, and privately he threw the finger into the man's ear, and spitting, he touched the tongue. If this isn't magnificently sacramental. It isn't simply how God speaks the word. And does the spittle, I know that's kind of an uncomfortable thing we don't like to talk about, but is there a connection between the mouth of Jesus and the mouth of this man? That the saving value actually is in the mouth of Jesus? And he put the finger in his ears, and he touched the fellow's tongue. Now, if we would actually describe this kind of a situation today, if somebody would do it, I think the kids in the congregation might say, hey, this is something a little bit gross. But there's something sacramental about it, that Jesus is doing this through the physical, not just through the spiritual or through the oral. And then it says, he looked up into the heavens and said to him, be opened, ephphatha, which means to be open. Now I'm assuming this is an Aramaic word, because the writer of the evangelist is assuming that the congregation, wherever that congregation may be, is not knows the word. Now, it also says, we know from 2 Peter that the Apostle Peter claims a closeness, a proximity to Jesus, that with the suggestion that other people weren't there. We were with him on the Holy Mount. He's the only one left. And so the person who is the witness to these things, I won't say that he's prideful. He's not prideful, but he does have a source of information which the others did not. It says immediately the ears of him were open, and immediately the chain or the thing binding his tongue was released, and he began to speak orthos. I love that term, orthos, and your people might enjoy this too. For this reason, the word orthos right here, orthos, because some of us, as we get a little older, orthos, that has to do with straight, as in orthodoxy, and orthopedic, and so forth. It has a kind of a medical flavor to it that there was something. He began to speak what was totally blurred before. Now, we know at the seminary that some students have a difficulty in articulating. Their consonants are not absolutely clear and precise. The language doesn't come out exactly on the point. Now, here is this fellow who was blurting out words this way. All of a sudden, he was speaking in a straight line. That's what the term orthos means. And then Jesus gave them this instruction, verse 36, that they were to tell no one. But the more he instructed them, they more abundantly proclaimed it. And this is a word that we have to look at too, and that is the last word in verse 36, ekkerison. The word ekkerison. That is the term that Paul uses for the preaching of the gospel. And does the evangelist here have the suggestion that this itself is the proclamation of Jesus? And these two pericopes lend themselves to narrative preaching. I do not consider myself a narrative preacher. I don't think I've done narrative preaching. Maybe I've done narrative preaching. And that is, some people have that ability. Some preachers have that ability. And they are to be, and I admire them for doing that. And that is, instead of getting into a doctrinal discussion of law and gospel, the majesty of God, justification, sanctification, or what this all means for me, is that we would just listen to the story of Jesus, because what Jesus is doing is salvation, and telling that particular story or narrative is the story of salvation. The account by itself creates the faith. Look what they said. All of a sudden, these people who are not ordained clergy persons, who are not apostles, they are the ones who are going and telling everybody what that is. I absolutely love it. And it does have a very positive effect, because the more they did it, the more they at least came to this conclusion about Jesus, that this guy knew what he was doing. He does all things well, because the deaf are hearing, and those people. And look at the second last word of the pericope there, and that's right, alalas. If you see, that's the word lalao, and you put an alpha negativum in front of it. That means an like an uncola, that alpha in the front of it. He makes the unspeaking ones to speak. And does this go back? Is there a note here in this account of Genesis and the creation of man, the creation of Adam? Is there something here about having a conversation with God, that Adam is God's conversational partner? That Adam, who hears the word of God but does not hear it, who was really set aside by God to speak the words of God, and he doesn't. So here is this pathetic creature who is deaf and is not able to speak. He hears the words of God, and he is speaking. Now, Luther understood things, and he understood things pretty well, because he said, well, how could a deaf man hear the gospel? How can a deaf man hear the gospel? And the answer is right here, is that the preaching of the word of God creates its own hearing. And I don't get to preach on Mark, and next Sunday I'll have an opportunity to do the next pericope. These are difficult pericopes. If we think in doctrinal terms, if we think in propositional terms, it's difficult because we're dealing with something else. We should stay away from the epistles and just stay with the words of Jesus. That counts first of all. Goes around, and by following the gospel accounts as they have been given to us by inspiration, we become different kinds of preachers. So in preaching this type, in preaching this pericope, in preaching this pericope from Mark, we're going to preach a different kind of sermon when this episode comes up again in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, vacation time is over. Labor Day is here. We get back to the routine of meetings. And so have a good weekend, and it's been a pleasure having the opportunity to work through this gospel with you.